Jennifer, thanks so much for joining me today on the Minimalist Moms podcast.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here.
I'm really glad to talk to you. Like I said, when we first got on the call, we have been trying to make this happen for some time now. So I'm glad to get to talk to face about your book, Never Enough. Before we get there, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself? Just a brief overview of who you are, and then we'll get started.
Sure, great. I'm a journalist. I've been a journalist for about, oh my gosh, 30 years. And I have three teenagers. I have an 18-year-old, I have a 17-year-old, and a 14-year-old. And Never Enough is my first book.
Yes, absolutely. And the subtitle is When Achievement Culture Becomes Toxic and What We Can Do About It. So today we're going to be talking about toxic achievement culture and why this was important to you, which I guess that's where we should start. What made you start to think about this and start to investigate this topic?
So over the years, I'd been noticing, just anecdotally, how different my children's childhood was from my own growing up. Family dinners were important to me, downtime on the weekends with my family was important to me, and yet our schedule was often overriding those things. Homework replaced family dinner. Our weekends, my husband and I were sort of fractured, going in opposite directions, one to a chess tournament, another to a soccer tournament. And I wanted to figure out, was I the only one feeling this way? Is this pressure being felt everywhere, just in New York City where I live? So that's sort of what prompted this idea, that just what was causing this shift? Why was childhood feeling so much more hectic and competitive now than when I was growing up?
Yes, absolutely. It really does. I mean, I can relate to that sentiment as well. And something that I actually heard you say with Katie Couric that I don't remember what it was called, what the media called it, but it was when I think it was Lori Loughlin and Felicity Huffman when they were basically supporting the colleges to get their kids in there, to paraphrase. And I remember when that happened, and I was like, dang, even the pressure. I mean, maybe you feel more pressure when you are successful and you are public facing. But it just seems crazy because it's like they could probably also buy themselves out of that. But there's something here, there's something going on. I'll let you go ahead and speak to that if you have anything to say.
Yeah, so this it was really that moment, the Varsity Blues scandal, that made me think, boy, this is really something that I need to investigate. Why was it that parents were now willing, well, not that they were willing, but now parents were going to jail to get their kids into selective colleges like USC and Georgetown. And so that's, I wanted to kind of dig into the roots. And actually, one of the parents who was caught up in the Varsity Blues scandal reached out to me after reading my book and hearing me speak. And I'll keep her anonymous, but she basically said to me that the beginning of the book really laid out what she was feeling, that it wasn't so much that she was trying to buy her way into a quote unquote good college, so much as she thought that it was her responsibility as a parent to set her kids up for success. So, when I was growing up, yes, my parents wanted me to be successful, but I don't think they were laying awake at night wondering, about my B minus in AP calculus and if I wasn't going to be a success. The way so many parents that I interviewed for this book were feeling. They were feeling the shift that's changed is that these parents were feeling responsible for making their kids a success. I'm not excusing the behavior of the Varsity Blues scandal, but rather I'm just trying to zoom out and put it into context. It's not as necessarily black and white as we think it is. There are enormous pressures that modern parents are under and facing today that our parents didn't have to face.
Yes, absolutely. Gosh, I wish my husband were here and we could both interview you because he's a high school teacher for a STEM school. And I mean, he sees this probably he sees it on the regular. And it is parents just wanting to know how can I get this A minus up to an A plus and the GPA is everything. To me, I was not this way. Maybe my parents were a lot more lax. So I can't necessarily relate to pressure my parents put on me or even feeling that, but that isn't often the case. So I want to know more about you and where you stood with your kids in this area.
Yeah. So, I was facing the pressures that I'm sure your husband's families that he knows in that school were facing too. I'm raising my kids in New York City in a very hyper competitive pond. Of course, I didn't realize that when we chose to raise our families in New York City. I wasn't thinking, oh boy, this is going to be a very competitive pond for my kids to compete in. But I was feeling the pressure more so than my parents felt to quote unquote make my kids a success. And here's why I think that is. I mean, I get into it a bit in the beginning of the book, sort of what these forces are that parents are contending with today. But the big story, I think, in all of this that we don't talk about is what I call the economic story. So when my parents were raising me in the 70s and the early 80s, life was generally more affordable. Housing was more affordable, healthcare was more affordable, college, higher education was more affordable. There was slack in the system. So parents like mine and yours could be relatively assured that even with some setbacks, even with that B minus in AP calculus that I got senior year, that most likely I'd be able to replicate my own childhood as an adult, if not do even better than my parents did. That's always been the American dream, to not only do as well as your parents, but to do even better. But we parents are facing a different economic reality. We are seeing the first generation, the millennials, who on average are not doing as well as their parents. They can't afford to buy the big home. They don't have job stability. We have witnessed the crush of the middle class. Steep inequity has been ushered in over the last few decades. And as one mother said, she felt like when her child was born that there was an elevator going up, and that if she didn't get her kids in the elevator at the very beginning with the travel sports and the tutoring, Kumon and math, that he would be left behind. And that was a story that I heard over and over again, including the parent that I spoke with who was involved in the Varsity Blues scandal, that they felt responsible for making their kids a success. And I too felt that way. I mean, I'll tell you a story that I talk about in the book. My oldest, William, who's now 18, every August and September, I get this sort of anxiety that trying to build their fall schedule. Were these the right activities? Did they have them involved in too much? Not enough? What latent talents were I possibly neglecting in my own kids? And so I tell this story that one year my son at the time was in middle school, and he was really interested in architecture and design. He was the kind of kid where I would bring him to the supermarket and he would be really interested in that little contraption that separates the plastic bags. And I thought, this is the spark of a passion. It's my job, I felt like in that moment, to foster it. But how do you build, a love of industrial design in a middle schooler? So I called around at a few schools in New York City. And one school did bite, and they said that, it was a class that was really aimed at older high school students and college students. It was an intro to architecture class. But if I'd be willing to sit next to him in class, that they would accept him in the class. So my middle schooler comes in from his, early days of school, and I said, honey, I have some exciting news for you. I have found a class that you are going to love. And he looked me in the eye and he said, Mom, I love architecture. Please don't ruin it for me. So I have been blessed with very verbal kids. So all of my missteps are called out by my own children. But I found that I wasn't alone in this feeling.
Yes, absolutely. I think, well, I'm curious, I'm assuming that your research showed that it was more of a bigger city issue than maybe in like middle of America. I won't speak for you in the research, but I'm curious to know that.
No, that's actually not what my research found. I conducted two large surveys. One was with the help of a researcher at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. We surveyed 6,500 parents all around the country, including Alaska.
Hmm.
And what I found was that the pressures, on average, there were trends based on where people were in the country, but that everyone, middle class and up, and frankly, even below middle class, were feeling the pressures, this never enough feeling.
Hmm.
And so what I found in the Midwest was that there were more buffers in place. So while the kids felt pressured, there were more buffers, be it belonging to a religious institution, having, the what I found, what was interesting in the Midwest was that in some of the towns that I went and met with parents, that the housing prices were more affordable than they are on the coasts. And so parents were less stressed about paying their bills than maybe parents in expensive urban areas or just outside major metropolitan areas. And that there is research that finds that these pressures can be found in a neighborhood level,
Mm.
and that the healthiest, the least stressed parents, and this is not my data, this is other data, are parents who live below their means.
Hmm.
So parents who live in middle and upper middle class communities who can afford to buy more, who choose not to. And there are a couple of reasons for this. One is that obviously the parents are less stressed when the roof needs to be replaced or the boiler has to be replaced. And that stress, therefore, is not sort of brought into the home, and a sense of contagion can happen with that.
Mhm.
And the second reason is something that I call in the book the encore effect. And that is the idea that that a child feels the pressure to replicate their childhoods. And I spoke with a child psychologist, Lisa Damore, and she said that often in her practice, kids who were really struggling were kids who felt like because their parents were corporate lawyers or investment bankers or successful entrepreneurs, that those kids had very limited options of what kind of colleges they could go to and what kind of careers they could pursue
Mhm.
if they were going to replicate their own childhoods. And so
Mhm.
that put an additional burden. Yes, I know we're talking about this privileged cohort, and we should probably address it now because I'm sure there are parents who are, potentially rolling their eyes and saying, okay, why are we talking about these kids who on paper are so privileged? And they absolutely are privileged. But what my research found, but even more importantly, two national policy reports found, was that these kids attending high achieving schools, these are those public and private schools all around the country, they are now considered an at risk group
Mhm.
after kids in poverty, kids with incarcerated parents, children of recent immigrants, children living in foster care. It's now this group. These high achieving kids are at risk, meaning they are 2 to 6 times more likely to suffer from clinical levels of anxiety and depression, and 2 to 3 times more likely to suffer from substance abuse disorder than the average American teen.
Mhm.
And so, yes, while these kids have privilege, as one researcher put it to me, we don't need to put pain on a scale. A
Mhm.
child in pain is a child in pain, and neither chooses their circumstances.
Yes, absolutely. And like you said a little bit earlier, you were talking about the pressure of everything is more expensive, and it is a keeping up with the Joneses. I actually think that minimalism and what I talk about here, living with less, you can live with less than you think, being intentional about what you bring in, not having too much. You could buy a lot more, but to what cost? Because again, then you have to maintain. And so I think people just do put so much pressure on themselves, but it's so rooted in fear. And like you said, if you're in pain, you're in pain. Why minimize that? Pain is all relative to the person. Do you have anything to say about how minimalism could influence this? I'm sure you probably have a lot
Yeah.
to say about that, but I'm curious.
No, I address it in the book. I don't necessarily call it minimalism, but what
Mhm.
minimalism means to me is being getting very clear about your values.
Yeah.
And so what I have found, and I have a chapter in the book about this in a section, which I think was really fascinating to me, is that our values
Mhm.
impact our mental health and well-being. So I'm going to oversimplify this just for the sake of time, but researchers around the world have found that we all have about a dozen core values inside of us. It doesn't matter if we live in Asia, South America, United States, we all have these inherent values. And researchers have divided them into intrinsic values and extrinsic values. Intrinsic values are things like wanting to be a good neighbor, wanting to grow spiritually, wanting to be pro-social, wanting to be good to the environment. The other group are really a set of materialistic values. It doesn't mean that you want all brand names. What materialistic values are really about is investing in things outside of yourself, the status of your job, the big house, the big car, popularity, image. Those external values, those materialistic values, as the researchers call them, are linked with negative mental health, substance abuse disorder, and lower levels of well being. Whereas intrinsic values are linked with the well being that we all want for our kids. And it's not that parents in these high achieving communities don't have good values, it's that they are constantly being bombarded by messages that activate the materialistic values that are inherent in all of us. So the pond that you are swimming in can, if you're not aware of it, can activate materialistic values. It's why, like, when you go into a mall and you're going in for one item, you wind up getting drawn into other things. That's because the mall is set up to activate your materialistic values. That's how they get you to spend more.
Mhm.
Advertising, social media, all of these things are activating our materialistic values. And so, what minimalism does, in my opinion, in my definition of it, minimalism to me is getting to the root of what you value and simplifying your life so that you have more time with your family, you have more time with your friends, you have more time doing things that really matter to you rather than accumulating things to
Yeah.
prove you matter. One of the things that really I found fascinating was that there's research to suggest that people who are very materialistic, so I would say almost the opposite of minimalists, people who are materialistic, it's not that they love material goods more than maybe you do. What it is that they are materialistic because they are hoping that those material things will earn them the love and the respect and the
Yeah.
companionship and relationship that they are lacking in their lives. So it's really people who are lacking deep, nourishing connections who can find themselves really being drawn to materialistic goods because what they hope is that those goods, that status, that popularity will earn them the love they so crave.
hmm Which is also rooted in probably a lack of sense of self. Like you don't have confidence if you think that those things bring your value. And I mean, that's honestly where I started when I became a minimalist. I had to stay out of the stores because it was so overwhelming to me to have to walk through there because I was just like, oh, I don't feel good about myself, but a new outfit will make me possibly look better to the outside world. Again, I was looking for that connection, but also I had to feel good about myself and say my value. No one was friends with me because of those things. They were friends with me because of what I brought to the relationship and who I am at a heart level. So that's something I want to teach my kids to take into to their adulthood with them. Just that sense of self and that sense of identity and peace. It doesn't matter what grades you get. Obviously, always try your best. But sometimes you don't excel as much in one area as another, and that's okay too.
You're reminding me of something that a very profound lesson that I learned in researching this book, and it
Mhm.
was visiting a school in Cleveland, Ohio called
Mhm.
St. Ignatius.
Mhm.
And their motto is the Jesuit motto, which is not better than others, but better for others.
Mhm.
And that to me is a way of really motivating yourself that you are not trying to be better than other people. It's not, life is not a zero sum game, but rather you strive to achieve so that you can add a positive value to the world,
Mhm.
that you can leave the world better than the way that you entered it.
Okay, so you talked somewhat about what we can do as parents in the home. You have the studies of what's happening. How can we combat that? What framework have you created to fight back against this toxic achievement culture?
So, as both a journalist, but also as a parent, I wanted to know who were the kids who were doing well despite the pressures? what, if anything, did they have in common? What did their parents focus on at home? How did they experience school? What was their relationship like with their teachers, with their peers? How did they see their role in the wider community? And with the help of a researcher, I found about 14 or so things that these, what I call in the book, healthy strivers had in common. And I get into it at length in the book, but it really boiled down to this. The kids who were doing well despite the pressure felt like they mattered to their parents for who they were deep inside, away from their achievements, away from their accomplishments. And importantly, they were relied on to add meaningful value back at home, at school, and in the wider community. So these kids who were doing well, they felt valued, they were depended on to add value, and mattering really acted like a kind of protective shield. It didn't mean that these kids didn't have setbacks. They bombed tests. They got rejected by friends. They weren't invited to the Friday night party.
Yeah.
But what mattering did is that it acted like a buoy that would lift them up. These setbacks were just temporary. It wasn't an indictment of who they were as people. They were firm in their sense of worth. The kids that I met who were really struggling were kids who fell in two camps. They were either kids who felt like their value, their mattering, was contingent on their performance or how they looked, as in, I only matter when. And then the other group, and this surprised me, were kids who felt like they mattered to their parents, but they were never relied on or depended on to add value back to anyone other than themselves. And so what these kids lacked is what I call in the book social proof that they mattered. They heard it in words, but they did not see in action how their little lives could help anyone other than themselves.
Yes, I've heard something recently. I'm not going to quote it to you perfectly, but just that we statistically mentally feel better when we're helping others than, yeah, that intrinsic self-motivation. Because it's like, what is this rooted in? Where is this coming from? If you're spiritual, you can get it from a higher power, but acting on that re-solidifies that thought in your brain and like the circuit, the wiring.
Absolutely. And I think what you're also pointing to is this idea that when we are overly self-focused,
Hmm.
we can really set ourselves up for mental health struggles.
Yeah.
It's helping our kids develop what I call in the book an other-oriented mindset. That is devoting time to helping others. Again, it's that being better for others, not than
Hmm.
others. That's
Hmm.
so protective. That other oriented mindset is so protective. One, because it shows us that we matter, that
Yeah.
we can make a positive impact. It's a way of feeding our mattering and taking us from outside of our own brains and
Hmm.
putting us out into the real world and making us feel appropriately small, right? That's one of the things that's so great about spirituality is that it puts things in perspective. Walking in nature, speaking to a higher God, believing that there's something bigger than us out there really helps to put our struggles into perspective.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Jennifer, as we wrap things up here, I would just love for you to give a final word of advice or encouragement to the listeners, and then we will find out where we can find you online.
Awesome. So, one of the things that I've adopted in my own house since researching the book is this idea from Ned Hallowell, who's a psychiatrist, and it's this: never worry alone. I think if we as parents can never worry alone, reach out to our friends when we're going through struggles, and if we can instill that in our kids, I think we can overcome so much if we know we're not going through life alone. So, never worry alone is something that I've adopted in my home, and I hope it's helpful for people out there.
Oh, yes, that's so great. Okay, well, Jennifer, where can listeners find you and grab a copy of Never Enough if they want to do so?
Awesome. So, the book is available anywhere where you buy your books. Amazon is having it currently at 50% off. And you can find me also on my website. And if you want to learn more about, buffering our kids against toxic achievement, head over to my website, jenniferbwallace.com. Sign up for my newsletter. Also, I'm on Instagram at Jennifer Breheny Wallace, and I post ideas on buffering against achievement pressure, but also instilling a sense of mattering in young people.
Great. Well, I always ask my guests two questions at the end of every episode. And the first one is, what's been a beneficial resource in your life that you want to share with the listeners?
Well, a beneficial resource to me is this idea of the family meeting, which is developed by someone named Alfred Adler. He was a contemporary of Freud's. And it is the idea that once a week you come together as a family to solve family problems so that our kids feel like they have a voice, that they matter in the home, that they could add meaningful value. And I have to say those meetings have really, in times when my kids, when we are not feeling gelled as a family, it's those meetings that really bring us back together.
That's funny. My husband has done that with our kids. He started it maybe a couple of years ago, even when our youngest was 2. But they do family meeting, they hold hands together, and they go in, out with their hands. And then he says, "What's one thing you all want to do? What's one thing we can help around the home?" And it's just so sweet and lovely. But I love that he does that. So I'm glad that you said that, because that's just, I really think it's been a powerful force in our life as well. Well, my last question is, what is something that you can't stop talking about?
I can't stop talking about mattering. It has completely changed my life, this concept. I'm in the process of writing my second book on adult mattering, because what I heard in my interviews with families all around the country is that adults today don't feel like they matter. They question their mattering at work. They question their mattering in their friendships. They feel lonely. They feel disengaged and burnt out. And so this next book that I'm writing, Mattering, building a life of value at home, at work, and in the wider world. Mattering has changed my life, and I'm going to devote the rest of my career to, spreading the word about mattering, because it's something actionable. It's something that we can do to battle against this loneliness epidemic that we are facing as a country.
Well, I'll definitely have to have you back whenever that book is released. I'm curious to just really dive deeper into that as well.
Excellent. Well, I will be excited to come back.
Yeah, well, I appreciate this conversation first and foremost, and I look forward to that next book. I will post everything in the show notes so people can find you and grab a copy of your book. So thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much.